Thanks for joining us for Faith Meets Mental Health with our host, Kim Boswell, the Alabama Commissioner of Mental Health. If you have any questions for our host, you can always email mentalhealth@frazer.church. We hope you enjoy this week's episode.
All right, well, welcome back, everybody. In this episode, we'll talk about why would a Christian need counseling, Pastor Chris?
Why would a Christian need counseling? It's interesting. My response to that question is, why wouldn't they need counseling? As we said last time, we're humans, and not only are we humans, we briefly admitted that there's been this history where this has been a taboo topic in the church, which just raises the need for the question. I would put it this way: everybody receives and gives counsel. Everybody does. There's no one that I know of ever who has never asked for counsel from someone, or advice, or a question, whatever you want to call it, from someone else, and then gotten an answer that they then applied to their life. And so the same is true when it comes to our mental health. For example, my wife loves to cook. Matter of fact, cooking is her hobby. She's really good at it. And every now and then, we'll go over to somebody's house, we'll eat a particular dish or whatever, and she will ask about the recipe, about how they made it and all that stuff. Now, has my wife ever cooked before? Yes, of course. Has she cooked similar dishes to that one before? Absolutely. But she's still getting counsel on how to cook that particular dish. And so whenever I think about counseling, that's, my mind kind of goes there of that when it comes to our mental health, what we're saying is, I've never done this thing or processed this issue or whatever it is in this particular way, in my context now, knowing what I know now, and I need someone to help me understand that.
Exactly. I know in my own experience, sort of went along life thinking everything was great and wonderful, had it all together, and went through a divorce and realized that, there might be a few things that I needed to process. Mm-hmm. And spent a fair amount of time in both individual counseling and group counseling. Mm-hmm. And then many years down the road, really all of a sudden just had a really hard time, couldn't quite figure out what was going on. There were some things that happened. Long story short, realized that, I did have some PTSD that wound up getting triggered, that sent me kind of off in down a rabbit hole a little bit. Because I was like, really? I've done all this counseling. I've done all these things. How can I be in this spot, Yeah. And so it was really interesting that even after, thinking that I had identified the issues that I needed to address, I really had missed some things related to just trauma that had happened early on, and didn't realize that, a particular event had triggered an episode of PTSD that I had a lot of trouble working my way out of. And so sometimes, particularly when it comes to trauma, if you haven't had a trigger, or you haven't been around maybe the person that, you were traumatized by, you can really be going along in life and doing just fine for many, many years, mm-hmm. and not realize that there's some things that you really haven't processed. And they're not, necessarily those things that we look at as sort of a classic mental health diagnosis of anxiety or depression, but just really often finding ways to cope other than those ways that are really healthy. Mm-hmm. A good friend of mine, her husband had a really traumatic childhood, but had, really been very successful as an adult. And then all of a sudden, a trigger, and he's off into addiction that he had never had before. Mm-hmm. And so, you really can't. Sometimes you think you can get past some of those issues, and that, you've been successful, and it's not going to have an impact, and then all of a sudden, one event, one death of a family member or something triggers it, and it's so important for people to find a way to be able to process that and to move through it in a meaningful way. I laugh because I have some young people who work for me, and it's funny because they don't think twice about going to see a counselor. Mm-hmm. Like, they're in that 30-year-old group, and they sit around and talk about, well, yeah, I'm going to see my counselor this week. Like, it is such a norm for them because they see the value in it, to have someone that really is going to give you wise counsel and is going to talk to you about the things that you're struggling with. They just see it as a really efficient way of working through problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And in many ways, this, some of that age group that you're talking about there, they really embody what is a central theme within the biblical community. It's Proverbs 11:14 that says, where no counsel is, the people fall, but in a multitude of counselors, there is safety. And again, in the church, sometimes we try to apply that to, I need good coaches or advisors or something like that. But it's speaking to who we are as a whole person. And I've always thought of that, multitude of counselors as being, you need multiple kind of lenses or camera angles looking at different aspects of your life. As you were saying, things can stay dormant for a long time, and then people can help you see things going on from different angles that you can't see. I mean, we can't step outside ourselves and look within, and so that safety that comes there, that help that comes there from having, different voices that are trusted and respected, of course, looking into our lives, speaking into our lives, that is something that's at the core of who Christians are. And I would even say it's normative Christian practice. It is Galatians 6:2, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. And so we just have to, and I think the younger generation is doing a better job of it, but give ourselves permission to really do that with one another.
And I think the more that we educate people about their mental health, the more, and really it's, as I tell people, maybe the only positive thing that came out of COVID is that there's this whole conversation about mental health that we began to have that we've never been able to have before. I mean, and I've worked for the department for many years, the Department of Mental Health, and there were a lot of years when nobody wanted to have a conversation with us about mental health because it was sort of this stigma around mental health. And so COVID really did open up that conversation so that people began to become aware of their mental health because, as you know, COVID challenged everyone's mental health. No one was immune from the stress that was involved in COVID. And so I think, being able, the more we talk about mental health and what mental health is and helping people identify those emotions and how to help regulate those emotions. I remember doing a presentation to the Blackburn Institute at the University of Alabama, and a young woman was sharing that, once she hit college, she developed an anxiety disorder. She said, but, now that I know what it is, I realized that at 9 years old, I was an anxious kid, but I just thought everybody felt that way. I didn't know that I was having anxiety because I really didn't have words for it.
Yeah.
And so it took her, it was sort of like by the time she hit college and the extra added stress of college, prompted her to seek counseling. And then she had a name for it. It's anxiety.
Yep.
And anxiety can be dealt with. And we know really that, by age 14, 50% of mental health issues are going to show up, and 75% by the time someone is 24. And so really being able to talk about mental health and to help people identify their feelings and be able to understand how their emotions work is probably one of the most important things, in my very biased opinion, we could do.
I don't think it's biased at all. I think it's really really discerning where we are today and the conversation that needs to be had on a much larger scale.
Yeah. It's, it was interesting. We've been very fortunate over the last few years to receive additional funding for mental health services in Alabama. But really what happened, and I tell people this, we could not have orchestrated any of that. We had members of the legislature that had family members or friends who had experienced traumatic issues with their mental health. We had a governor who's deeply committed to the mental health issue. And I just feel like God just absolutely orchestrated all of that to really do the things that we had been wanting to do for many years. But when you look at it, it's like none of us could have planned that. None of us could have made all that happen independently. It really took, honestly, people who were Christians who felt strongly about the issue. If it's just kind of my observation, because I've been around a little while and I've seen it when it wasn't like that. And it's pretty easy for me to look at it and say there was some divine intervention there. That didn't just happen by chance. But it was a collective group of people who really, truly had a heart for the mental health issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the more ways that church can come alongside and not replace the role of the mental health professionals, but come alongside and support and advocate for that and even be a conduit, I think the healthier we'll all be and we'll get. And I just think that the church, whatever the past has been around these kind of conversations and dividing walls that are there has to be more bridges built between the two communities, because they're interlocked, more so than what we probably have admitted in the past.
And I know that's just one of the things that we've been working on really as a department, is really to figure out where people are showing up, whether it's they're showing up at church and they're having a conversation with their pastor, whether it's a mom and kid showing up in the pediatrician's office, so that we want to do work with pediatricians. But the church is such a huge place where people show up and do seek advice from their pastor. Again, it's back to the trust issue. That's the trusted advisor. And to the degree that we can help people seek that counseling if they need it, is such a great way to really improve physical health, mental health, and spiritual health for this community. And I think that's just an absolute joy to be a part of that as a Frazer member, and certainly as the commissioner in the Department of Mental Health.
Thanks again for listening, and don't forget, if you have any questions that you would like to be discussed on an upcoming episode, you can always email mentalhealth@frazer.church. Also, you can view video of our episodes on frazer.church/videos or on youtube.com/frazerchurch. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.